Hey there, everyone. This is Gregg Schutze for ReadyForTheDraft.com, and this is the Ready for the Draft podcast, episode 34 of the 2020 podcast series, getting you ready for the NFL Draft, set to begin April 23rd through the 25th. Completely virtual draft, war rooms, not going to be at the facilities. It's going to be completely virtual. Really, I guess your war room is going to be your Zoom chat, if you will. And then really, what's the green room going to look like for all of these prospective draftees? We don't have an actual green room physically at a site. So how's that going to play out? Really going to be interested to see what that looks like. And we made the transition last podcast from taking a look at how free agency really impacted draft needs for all 32 of the franchises to taking a look at each of the positions and really going position by position, talking about draft stock for each of the players at those positions and really taking a look at who's going to be coming off the board in round 1 all the way through 7. Also took a little bit, a look at the history of the positions as well, how the draft played out in the previous 5 drafts. And we're going to do that again with this podcast, really hammering home the skill position players on offense. We're going to take a look at the receivers and the tight ends. With the way the game is changing, you know that you're going to have weapons there in the passing game. You can never have enough good wideouts on your team. The receivers, the tight ends. Tight end is really kind of changed and evolved. Really you have a lot of guys. You look at what George Kittle's been able to do recently. Rob Gronkowski when he was with the Patriots. Obviously, Tony Gonzalez and Antonio Gates and guys like that really have what they've done for this position. Obviously, Zach Ertz and Travis Kelce. You can just rattle off all these tight ends that have really played well. Darren Waller and Mark Andrews, some of the younger guys that have really started to make a name for themselves. So is there that guy in this year's draft that might be the next Travis Kelce or the next Evan Engram there for the Giants? We'll take a look at these guys and really break things down. At the receiver position, there might be the next Darren Waller sitting in that group. There are a lot of big physical wideouts. So we'll crunch the numbers, take a look at everything. Obviously, I hope everyone is being safe. COVID-19 really kind of changes the game for the draft this season. And look, I want to make sure that this podcast continues all the way up through the draft because we need to have an outlet. We need to have something to talk about, have something to look forward to. And so these podcasts will continue on all the way through the draft. Stick with me. We'll go ahead and cover a lot of material. So let's jump right into that wide receiver position, shall we? So when we take a look at the wide receiver position over the past 5 drafts, what's really interesting is the 2020 draft is being compared a lot to that 2015 draft. Now, you'll remember the 2015 draft because, a lot of explosive wideouts in that draft. Amari Cooper, Devontae Parker, Nelson Aguilar, Rashad Perriman. That was really the group that, had the most first-round picks of the last 5 drafts with 6. And really, you kind of have to go one draft prior to that to really say this is, from a depth standpoint, the depth of the 2014 class really was ridiculous. Going back, I said we were going back 5 years, but screw it. Let's go ahead and go back 6 years. 2014, Sammy Watkins coming number 4 overall to the Bills, and Mike Evans number 7 to the Bucks. It didn't stop there though. ODB, Odell Beckham Jr., OBJ, ODB, however you want to call him, went to the Giants there at number 12. Brandon Cooks to the Saints, number 20 overall. Brandon Cooks now has a new address there in Houston. Kelvin Benjamin to the Panthers, number 28 overall. But then you got into the second round. There was Marquise Lee, Jordan Matthews. Devontae Adams falls all the way to number 53 overall there in the second round. Allen Robinson had some good seasons there in Jacksonville and with the Bears. Look, Jarvis Landry, number 63 overall. I mean, who would have thought that he would have fallen that far? John Brown, 1,000-yard season with the Bills. He went to the Cardinals at number 91. I mean, this list just keeps going on and on, with wide receivers that are making an impact. Look, Ryan Grant fell all the way to round number 5, the kid out of Tulane. He's still in the league making an impact. TJ Jones was a wide receiver there for the Lions. He came off the board in round number 6. So this, again, a draft class 33 wide receivers taken, and again, 5 taken in the first round. Now, when I say 2015 and comparing that to 2020, what I'm talking about is really the star power at the top of the draft. And again, we had 5 receivers taken in round number 1, or I'm sorry, 6 receivers taken in round number 1, and not all of them panned out. Kevin White of the Bears, turned into a major bust. Nelson Aguilar, kind of up and down career there with the Eagles. Brashad Perriman really trying to resurrect his career. Philip Dorsett, more of a complimentary player. Devin Smith didn't really pan out there with the Jets, coming off the board in round number 2. Dorial Green-Beckham, Devin Funchess. So a lot of guys there at the top of the draft, guys that were trying to make a name for themselves, and they just really couldn't gain any traction at the next level. Jamison Crowder, a possession receiver, a guy that I really like coming out of Duke, came off the board in round number 4, number 105 overall. He's there with the Jets. I mean, come on. Maybe the biggest steal of this draft. I wouldn't say maybe, it is the biggest steal of this draft. 2015, number 146 overall, the 10th pick in the 5th round, Stephon Diggs coming out of Maryland to the Vikings. Unreal that he lasted that long in the draft. So that's proof that it doesn't really matter, a lot of times where these guys get drafted. It's ultimately what happens out on the football field. Shoot, I forgot about this. You go all the way down to round number 6, 204 overall, a kid out of Georgia Tech, wound up becoming a Pro Bowl tight end. Darren Waller went to the Ravens, had battles with some of those demons, and ended up coming off the board there in round number 6. So 2015, there were 35 receivers taken. I actually have 35 receivers coming off the board in 2020. 6 receivers in round number 1, kind of some parallels there for my draft. And then after that, you look at it, and I've got 5 going in round 2 and 3 in round 3 versus 3 in round 2 and 5 in round 3 in 2015. So it's kind of interesting to see some of that dynamic and the comparisons between those two drafts. In 2016, this was a draft. We had 31 receivers come off the board, 4 in round number 1, just 3 in round 2, and 2 in round 3. And then it was really loaded, on the back end, 5 in rounds 4 and 5, and 6 in a piece in 6 and 7. But 2016, if you'll recall, this was a draft that had Corey Coleman, Will Fuller, Josh Doxson, Laquan Treadwell, coming off the board in round number 1. Those receivers really struggled to make an impact for their franchises. If you look at it, only Will Fuller is still on the same roster that he was drafted, there in Houston with the 21st overall pick. But it was all about round 2, man. You had Sterling Shepard coming off the board, from OU to the Giants, number 40 overall. 7 picks later, Michael Thomas, the stud receiver there for the Saints. Tyler Boyd, just another 8 picks later there, coming out of Pittsburgh to the Bengals, really has stepped up his game. Let's see. After that, Rashard Higgins and Tyreek Hill. And, coming off the board in round number 5, Tajay Sharp there with the Titans. He's actually moved on, and trying to find some success elsewhere. But, some receivers, really right there in the middle of that, the first couple of rounds of that draft, really, were the standouts of that draft class. 2017, you had 14 receivers taken in the first 3 rounds. I actually have 14 coming off the board in 2020. But 2017, 32 total receivers taken, and that's when we had kind of a drop off. We had Corey Davis, Mike Williams, and John Ross, all really looked at as first round picks. And then after that, it dropped off considerably after that. So what happens? All 3 of them were taken in round, not only in round number 1, but they were taken in the top 10. Davis going number 5 to the Titans, Mike Williams 7 to the Chargers, and John Ross going 9 overall to the Bengals. After that, Zay Jones, Curtis Samuel, Juju Smith-Schuster, all going in round number 2. Cooper Kupp fell all the way to the Rams at 5th pick of the 3rd round. Chris Godwin, man, he went number 84 overall to the Buccaneers. Kenny Golladay, just 12 picks later there to the Lions. They're, two guys that arguably are their number one options. I think Mike Evans might have a little bit of say there with Chris Godwin, but Kenny Golladay really being that feature receiver for Matthew Stafford with the Lions. Dede Westbrook came off the board in round number 4 for the Jags. He's a vertical threat there for them. So there were some nice picks there, at the top of that draft. And then 2018, this was the year they had 33, really back heavy. They had 8 receivers taken in round number 6, oddly enough. But you only had 9 receivers taken on the first 2 days of the draft in 2018. And this was a draft you had DJ Moore, Calvin Ridley at the top. After that, Cortland Sutton, Dante Pettis, Christian Kirk, Anthony Miller, James Washington, DJ Chark. Those were all receivers that were good complementary receivers coming out of their respective colleges, but guys that you really didn't see being that breakout star. Cortland Sutton certainly doing that in Denver. Dante Pettis had a nice rookie season. DJ Chark starting to come around there in Jacksonville. Look, Michael Gallup came off the board, number 81 overall to the Cowboys, and you see what he's been able to do there in Dallas, 1,000-yard receiver there. As you go through it, Deshaun Hamilton is a role player there for the Broncos. They got him number 113 overall in round number 4. Marquez Valdez-Scantling, the vertical threat there for the Packers, went off the board in round number 5, 174 overall. So as you go through that draft, there's still some complementary receivers that came off the board, but really a draft that kind of, you didn't have that, lacked the star power at the top of the draft. And what's interesting when you look at 2019, only 28 receivers. That was the fewest total in the last 6 years. Marquise Brown and N'Keal Harry were the only 2 receivers that came off the board in round number 1. After that, my number 3 receiver was A.J. Brown, really a difference maker there for Tennessee. He was actually the 4th receiver taken. You had Deebo Samuel. You saw what he was able to do for the 49ers, hoping to get a complimentary receiver that can really play off of his skill set. Mecole Hardman played an impact there for the Chiefs. Round number 2, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. I think the Eagles are really expecting him to take off this next season. After that, DK Metcalf, really the guy, you saw him at the combine, the speed, but you worried about his 3-cone drill, the short shuttle, and he ended up showing some explosiveness there for the Seahawks. Fell all the way to number 64. Terry McLaurin had a nice rookie season there with Washington and came off the board in round number 3. Miles Boykin also in round 3. My favorite receiver, number 1 on my board, was Hakeem Butler. Fell all the way to number 4. I think there were some issues with the drops. He battled some injuries, so he'll be coming back there in Arizona in 2020. Hunter Renfrow, 5th round pick there of the Raiders. Really a nice possession receiver. Darius Slayton, vertical threat for the Giants, also off the board in round number 5. So there are some players that can be had in the middle rounds. And look, Olabisi Johnson, coming from Colorado State, number 247 overall, not only makes the Viking roster, but a guy who I think has a future there with that franchise, and a guy that I think you're going to see a lot more. He's going to play a bigger role now that Stephon Diggs is no longer in Minnesota. So 2020, I'm looking, I mentioned that I had 14 receivers coming off the board in the first 3 rounds. And then I got 9 receivers that are coming off the board in round number 4. I look at this draft and I think there are receivers to be had on all 3 days. And there's a little bit of everything. You've got the vertical threats, you've got the possession receivers, you've got the big physical wideouts, and you've got some freaks of nature in this group. A little bit of everything. And I think that's what's so exciting about this year's draft at the wide receiver position, top to bottom, just a stacked group. So let's go ahead and take a look at my mock draft, and really let's take a look first at these 6 wideouts that I have coming off the board in round number 1. I think the talk of the draft, really should be CeeDee Lamb there at the top. I know there are some people that talk about CeeDee Lamb. They don't see him as being the explosive wideout, but man, you put on that game film against Texas, and the way that he was just able to manhandle defensive backs, just make him look silly out there. CeeDee Lamb, yes, some of his ability to get open was predicated on that offense, allowing him to be out in the open. But at the same time, look, over 3,200 yards receiving, 19 yards per reception, 32 touchdowns. This past season, over 1,300 yards and 21.4 yards per catch. A guy who was just really explosive on the outside, a huge catch radius. And he wasn't the burner. When you watch him play, you don't think he's running all that fast. But I was saying if he could run, if nothing else in the low 4.5s, then he has a shot to be a guy that could potentially be considered in the top 10. Runs a 4.5 40 at the combine, 6'2", 198. And look, a guy he's physical after the catch, a guy that can get open, runs excellent routes. I'm a big fan of CeeDee Lamb. I think he's a guy that can go there to the Jets at 11 overall. And, I know the Jets were looking for really beefing up their wide receiver core, with the addition of Rashad Perriman. They brought in Josh Doxson, hoping that he would resurrect his career. Quincy Enunwa, Jamison Crowder. But that group, they're lacking that number one, that go-to wideout, a guy that Sam Darnold can really rely on and lean on in that receiving core. And I think this is the guy. I think CeeDee Lamb, you come in there, this is the guy that's going to be able to do that, much like he did for Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray, and Jalen Hurts. So then getting to play with Sam Darnold on top of that, 4 really good quarterbacks, all of whom have a chance to start at some point at the next level. I think Jalen Hurts has a chance. Give him a couple of years, and we'll see where he's at, in terms of his development. But CeeDee Lamb, you add him to the mix. I think that makes a ton of sense. There are rumors, man. If I've got Bleacher Report on my phone, and every time something pops up from them, it starts making me question everything about my draft. And they're talking about how there's a lot of interest with Henry Ruggs. And you look at this group, and they have a lot of bigger receivers, except for Jamison Crowder. But Crowder's really your possession guy, a guy that knows how to get open. But Doxson, Perriman, and Enunwa, all bigger receivers. What they really lack is that vertical threat. So it got me thinking, what if the Jets go Henry Ruggs III at number 11? It could happen. Look, what happened last year? Everyone was picking N'Keal Harry to be the number one wideout, coming off the board. And what happens? Marquise Brown happens. The lightning speed comes off the board, number 15 overall. There's a good chance that Henry Ruggs goes to the Jets. Now, Henry Ruggs, look, 4.27 40, explosive playmaker, better route runner than Marquise Brown was. A guy, also a 42-inch vertical leap. So even though he's only 5'11", a guy that can go up and attack the football in the air. And look, only 88 receptions, but 24 touchdowns, meaning he caught a touchdown pass every 4.08 receptions, which is just unheard of in terms of his production. A guy that just eats up the cushion if you're playing an off coverage, and a guy that, look, loves to go across the middle, loves to run those slants. And the thing that's so deadly about him is he'll run a quick slant, he'll catch the ball in stride, and the moment that he makes that catch, he's getting north and south. He's getting vertical. He's not necessarily taking that slant across the field, across the middle. He wants to get up that seam and really be a home run hitter whenever possible. Sometimes he'll head across the field, but he's looking to be a little bit more elusive in the open field with that. So watch out for him with the Jets. I think when I look at the Raiders to me, the feel is either CeeDee Lamb or Jerry Jeudy. So in the event CeeDee Lamb comes off the board with the Jets, I think Jerry Jeudy goes to the Raiders. I think if Henry Ruggs somehow goes to the Jets, then I think at that point what you're looking at is CeeDee Lamb going to the Raiders, and then Jerry Jeudy in all likelihood going to the 49ers. What you get with Jerry Jeudy is, he's the 2018 Biletnikoff Award winner, and a guy, look, very explosive off the ball, a guy that's really hard to jam, wins at the line of scrimmage. And once he does that, he's got you in trouble. Running a sub 4.5 40 at the combine, over 1,300 yards in 2018, 19.3 yards per reception, 26 total touchdowns in his career, 24 of those in the last 2 seasons. And I think what is really special about him is the route running ability. He's so sudden, and I think what he does really well is, the stem at the top of his route, being able to really, he'll use a quick jab step or a plant, and has that corner really in the spin cycle, and then he'll make his cut off of that move. And a lot of times you'll see him on either a post corner or he's running a sluggo or something like that. And he really gets the corner turned around with a lot of his route running ability. And he sinks those hips and explodes out of his breaks. He doesn't really slow down. That speed really puts a lot of pressure on the defensive back, and it makes it really hard for them to mirror his actions. And once he gets the ball in his hands, he's dynamic after the catch. And I would say that his role with Alabama changed. He went from being the guy in 2018 to, look, I can be more of that volume catcher, be that security blanket for Tua. Only, averaged 15.1 yards per reception in 2019. He let Henry Ruggs, Devontae Smith, and Jalen Waddle really be those explosive playmakers, and this guy was more of your that security blanket. You know what? When we need a big play, we're going to go to Jerry Jeudy, and I think that really speaks to a level of maturity there with Jerry Jeudy, really understanding who he is and what's needed from him. Each particular, not only just the year, but even game to game, really what's needed out of him to be successful. He's got to cut out the drops, the easy drops especially. I think, the contested catches, he needs to get, the hands need to be a little bit stronger. But look, the lapses in concentration, if you're getting vertical, you've got a guy beat, just make sure that you catch the ball. You're going to have a big play. Just make sure you catch that football. And there were times where the ball would go through his hands or he would bobble it and drop it. He's got to cut that out. And that's really the biggest thing for a wide receiver at the next level. That's going to be the kiss of death. It's when you have those hands that aren't reliable. And so that's the biggest thing that I think for Jerry Jeudy that he's going to have to watch out for. And I think that could potentially be why teams may favor Henry Ruggs over Jerry Jeudy. You'll have to keep an eye on that. The Bama versus Bama, let's see what happens there. I'll be really interested to see what happens because, if the Raiders sitting there at number 12, I still think Jerry Jeudy's their guy because of that versatility. But look, speed kills. And the thing that I really like about Henry Ruggs is his route running ability. And when you've got Zay Jones, Tyrell Williams, Nelson Aguilar, Hunter Renfrow, you look at that and I think you need a speedster. I think you need a guy that has speed. Both of those guys have it. So that's really going to be the big question mark is what direction does Mike Mayock and company, what direction do they go? So those are really my top three receivers. I think it's going to be in any order there. You can't really go wrong. The one thing that's really going to throw things off is if somehow the 49ers go with a corner because, there's rumors that Denver may be trying to trade up. And those rumors, I saw that off a Bleacher Report. And again, it questions everything that I've done with my draft up to this point when I start seeing some of those things. And, Tampa talking about trading up to get an offensive lineman. I feel pretty good about that because that's what I was picking all along. I have Tampa taking Tristan Wirfs at number 14. But Broncos taking a receiver. Who did I have going to the Broncos every single mock draft with the exception of this past one? It's Henry Ruggs. And I think if the Broncos are looking to try to trade up, get ahead of the Jets, get ahead of the Raiders, get ahead of the 49ers, I think they're targeting Henry Ruggs. And if that does happen, if they can get ahead of the Browns, because the Browns, look, again, going back to Bleacher Report and what they're reporting with Mekhi Becton, the fact that, teams are worried about his love of food. Bleacher Report was reporting that this is a guy that loves to cook, loves to eat, and he's already a big dude. There's a chance that his stock could fall. And the Browns could sit there and trade down to 15 and still land Mekhi Becton. And the Broncos could still end up getting Henry Ruggs. So what ends up happening is you get Ruggs. Let's play this out. Ruggs at 10. CeeDee Lamb goes to the Jets at 11. The Raiders ultimately at 12 get Jerry Jeudy. And then at 13, the 49ers now, I think at that point you have to go corner and you go CJ Henderson, which then means the 49ers will go with the receiver at number 31 overall. So let's marinate on that just a little bit. We'll go ahead and move on to the next three in my round one. I'm looking at the Eagles. They need a receiver, and you're saying, well, you just mentioned that they took J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. But look, Arcega-Whiteside, less than 20 receptions. He is supposed to be the answer for Alshon Jeffrey, who's battled injuries. Look, he and Deshaun Jackson both battled injuries. Nelson Aguilar no longer on the roster. He battled injuries as well. Deshaun Jackson, excuse me, not going to be a long-term answer, not a long-term fit there. So I think when you look at that wide receiver core, you need a guy who's going to be able to get open, a guy that can be reliable, and really Alshon Jeffrey, Deshaun Jackson, they're signed through 2021, but there is a chance that either or both of those guys could potentially be cut at the end of the season. And so the guy that I'm really targeting for them is Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson, look, for LSU, he and Jamar Chase, just video game type numbers, over 110 receptions, 1,540 yards, 18 touchdowns on the year. He was a volume catcher, a guy that would have those explosive plays, but he knew how to get open, very sudden with his routes. And I was really surprised, with his 40 time. I was not expecting him to run as fast as he did. Jefferson ran a 4.43, also showed off a 37.5-inch vertical leap. So this guy has some speed to him as well, and some explosiveness that, we didn't always see there with LSU. And look, he was a big play guy, but some of that was also, dependent upon Joe Brady's offense and what was really dialed up for him. But I like Jeudy. I like Justin Jefferson. I like Jerry Jeudy as well, but I like Justin Jefferson there to the Eagles. I think it makes a lot of sense there. Eagles get a guy there at the wide receiver position that can really help out. After that, I'm looking at number 22 overall, and I'm looking at Minnesota. Stephon Diggs is gone. So then you look at that receiver core, and Adam Thielen, Olabisi Johnson, they picked up Tajay Sharp from Tennessee, mentioned him earlier, but that receiver core, I think they're really lacking another playmaker to team with Adam Thielen. I think Olabisi Johnson is going to be a nice slot receiver. Tajay Sharp is more of a possession receiver. You need to get another big play guy on the outside, and I'm looking T. Higgins out of Clemson. And look, I know T. Higgins against LSU was pretty much shut down by those corners out there, and that's obviously some cause for concern. Is he going to be an explosive playmaker there on the outside? And I'll argue that absolutely T. Higgins can do that. And what Pro Football Focus noted, I think what is really interesting is, in 2019, Higgins was targeted 23 times on deep balls, hauled in 15 of those passes for 565 yards. So he's proven to be a threat down the field, a huge catch radius, a weapon in the red zone, posted consecutive seasons with at least 59 receptions, and finished with 25 total touchdowns. But in 2019, eclipsed that 1,000-yard mark, averaging 19.8 yards per reception, and had a 5-game stretch in November and early December where he totaled 10 touchdowns. Performance against Virginia in the ACC Championship, put on that film. You want to talk about dominant. 9 receptions, 182 yards, and 3 touchdowns in that victory over the Cavaliers. It really springboarded Clemson into the college football playoff. I think if you team T. Higgins with Adam Thielen, you've got a nice 1-2 punch there for Kirk Cousins. And, you're going to miss Stephon Diggs and his playmaking ability, but don't sleep on T. Higgins. I think that'd be a nice pickup for them. So then we move on. Who's next? I think the Packers have to get some help there at the receiver position, and I think that's a must, right? It makes perfect sense that you have to go receiver, and really what you saw out of Green Bay was when you take Devontae Adams out of the mix, they really struggled. He missed 4 games. Still hauled in 83 passes, including 8 games with at least 7 receptions. So not only is he one of the top wide receivers, but you can see just how much Aaron Rodgers relies on him. The running backs, Aaron Jones, Jamal Williams, were number 2 and number 3 in terms of receiving for the Packers. Now look, the trio of Allen Lazard, Geronimo Allison, Marquez Valdez-Scantling combined for 95 passes, caught for over 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. Alice is no longer on the roster. I like Allen Lazard. I think he's a receiver that can be a reliable option for them. And look, if you really wanted to bulk him up, I think he has the frame to be a pretty reliable tight end as well. That's always an option. They picked up Devin Funchess. You've got Marquez Valdez-Scantling, the speedster out on the outside. I don't know that I necessarily trust his hands. Equinemius St. Brown has battled some injuries. You need to get another receiver out there. And, I think you need to get one fast for Aaron Rodgers before he blows the gasket there working with Matt LaFleur. And, there are a lot of receivers that are out there. We talked about, Brandon Aiyuk, Jalen Reagor, Laviska Shenault. But I'm going with Denzel Mims, 6'3", 207 out of Baylor. Look, man, ran a 4.38 40, 38.5-inch vertical leap, showed up at the Senior Bowl, and not only displayed his flair for the acrobatic catch, especially along the sideline and in the end zone, especially in the corner of the end zone. The body control was ridiculous, showing off that leaping ability and the catch radius. But man, it was the blocking. I felt bad for Lavert Hill because he continually dominated the poor Michigan corner, just locking him onto him and just driving him down the field, sustaining the block for well over 5 yards. And you saw that time and time again in that Baylor Bear offense. And really, Mims posted 1,000-yard seasons in 2017 and 2019, finished the career with 28 touchdowns. And if you really watch the tape, he wins in a variety of ways. He can beat you vertically, can snap off his routes, come back to the quarterback as well, uses his length to his advantage with that huge catch radius, creates light separation down the field with his arm before really able to elevate over the corner and haul in the pass. Tremendous with his adjustments, as I mentioned, with the football in the air, contorting his body to make sure that he has the catch while also keeping his feet in bounds. Really the awareness of where he is on the field. Nightmare in the red zone. Elevating over the defensive backs on a fade on one play, then the next he'll take advantage of that situation and win off the line with a nice slant to the inside. Really kind of puts that corner again in the spin cycle, as we mentioned earlier. I think he's a guy that I would argue is, his skill set is one of the more unique ones of the receivers in this draft class. And I think he'd be a nice compliment to Devontae Adams. So those are really the 6 wideouts that I have coming off the board in round number 1. If there's going to be another receiver that could potentially go to the 49ers at number 31 overall, I'm going to throw a name out there right now, and this could potentially change with my draft. Michael Pittman Jr. I actually have him coming off the board, number 34 overall to the Colts, because I think he'd be a nice compliment to T.Y. Hilton. But Michael Pittman Jr., look, they don't have a ton of big receivers there for the 49ers. They have a lot of guys that are the exact same in terms of their body type and some of their skill sets. Pittman Jr., over 1,200 yards, and look, he dominated Utah down the field, making the catches. This is a guy who's very physical after the catch, hard to bring down, but throughout the season, teams put up game plans to stop Michael Pittman Jr. And the receiving core there for the Trojans is no joke. They have a lot of guys who have NFL talent, and really they were worried about Michael Pittman Jr. We got to stop, this big wideout there on the outside. They're okay if some of these other guys stop, can end up beating us, but we've got to stop this guy. And I think that takes a special receiver, to really take all that focus from a defense and really just focused on one guy. You talk about that with edge rushers. You talk about that with linebackers sometimes. And, to have a receiver really have all that type of focus from a defense, not just, one man. I mean, it's the entire defense really making sure that they are keeping an eye on where he is on the field at all times. To me, I think that's worthy of a first round pick. And so I think the 49ers, if they can't get Ruggs there, number 13, and they go with C.J. Henderson, I think that Michael Pittman Jr. would be the guy. The Broncos, if they don't get Henry Ruggs, if they can't trade up and Henry Ruggs comes off the board, they still need that speedster because, look, Drew Lock needs that vertical threat. He had that at Mizzou. When Emmanuel Hall was healthy, Drew Lock was a different type of quarterback. And that was really his comfort zone, was airing it out and dropping it into his vertical threat. That was his sweet spot. He has a tight end like Albert Oyebunam that he had at Mizzou in Noah Fant. If he gets that speedster on the outside, Jalen Reagor post 4.2 40. It was in the 4.2s on social media as part of his workout, and that vertical ability, I think it's going to complement Drew Lock very well. So if it's not Henry Ruggs, I think they have to go after Jalen Reagor in round number 2. Moving on from there, Steelers. I think the Steelers need another wideout. And you're looking at it going, well, wait, didn't they just draft, James Washington? You mentioned that they did. And yeah, they have James Washington, and they have Juju Smith-Schuster. So we know that took place. Juju really needed Antonio Brown, though. I think with the absence of Antonio Brown in that offense, I think you saw his production drop. I like Deontay Johnson. So Washington and then Johnson in the last two drafts. Deion Kane still on the roster, Ryan Switzer. But I think what you're lacking is a big physical receiver on the outside. And yes, you have Eric Ebron at tight end that you brought in. There's Vance McDonald on the roster. Zach Gentry's a nice piece there at the tight end position. But I'm looking at Chase Claypool. And this dude, he's 6'4", 238 pounds, and he shows up at the combine. I'm thinking there's no way. I mean, this guy's going to be a Darren Waller type. And what does he do at the combine? Runs a 4.42 with a 40.5-inch vertical leap. You wonder what they're feeding these guys in South Bend. Miles Boykin the year prior just really surprised people with what he was able to do at the combine as well. So I think Chase Claypool gives them a dynamic on this team that they don't currently have at the wide receiver position. And depending on what happens on the tight end spot, he may end up sliding into a tight end position as well. That's something to keep an eye on. Brandon Aiyuk could very well, go in the first round. There's talk that he could go that high. I actually am targeting him to the Bears. I think you need to get a compliment for Allen Robinson there in Chicago. And whether it's going to be Mitchell Trubisky or Nick Foles that's really throwing the passes there, you got to get some help. Cordero Patterson, Anthony Miller. Patterson's not really the reliable target. Anthony Miller battled some injuries. He's more of a possession guy. Allen Robinson's your number one. You bring in a guy like Brandon Aiyuk, who has, I don't know that he's necessarily a wide receiver one, but he definitely feels like at least a wide receiver two. Excellent length. I think that's one of the things that you definitely see when Brandon Aiyuk plays. 65 catches, over 1,100 yards, 8 touchdowns on the year. He's not getting out of round two, and I think if he's there when the Bears are drafting, I think you have to take him. Now, Laviska Shenault, once thought of as a first rounder, I'm really concerned about his durability. That's really my biggest concern. He couldn't stay out on the field, couldn't stay healthy. Ran a 4.58 40. What was really weird was he showed up at the combine. A lot of guys wearing the tight jerseys and things like that. He's wearing this baggy jersey, and I couldn't really figure out why. Runs at 4.58. That didn't really feel right. So I was wondering, was it something about his conditioning? Really, what happened there? And look, when Viska's healthy, this guy can be a beast, and what was fun, if you ever get a chance to watch USC and Colorado this past season, those two guys were trading, touchdown for touchdown and just explosive play after explosive play. And Laviska Shenault has the versatility to play all over the field. I think that's one of the things that's fun about watching his game. Played in 7 games as a freshman, 9 games as a sophomore, and just 11 games in 2019 as a junior. So just 149 catches, just over 1,900 yards, 10 touchdowns, and then carried the ball 42 times, had 7 touchdowns on the ground as well. I think he's explosive. He has some versatility to him. And the Rams lost Brandon Cooks. And yes, they have Robert Woods. They have Cooper Kupp. They have some receivers there at the position. But adding another wideout, that's going to be their first pick in round number 1. There's Laviska Shenault, and I think they're also going to draft Cam Akers, get a running back on that roster. So that really kind of rounds out my round number 2. So what's crazy is you can get a receiver like Donovan Peoples-Jones in round number 3. And I think Donovan Peoples-Jones really took everyone by surprise with what he did at the combine. Not only did he run the 4.48, but the 44.5-inch vertical leap. I mean, this guy can jump out of the building. And 6'2", 212, over 33-inch arms, some of the longer arms among the receiver class, and a guy who is absolutely explosive. And he really, it wasn't his fault. You look at Michigan, they had a bunch of receivers there. They had Nico Collins and Tariq Black, easy to kind of get fallen off in that mix. But then he also had, really didn't have the best quarterback play. I thought Shea Patterson was very inconsistent the last 2 seasons. And look, this is a guy, just 103 receptions, just over 1,300 yards and 14 touchdowns. He's going to be a better pro than he was a collegiate player. And really what you look at with him is, I'm looking at Detroit at the top of round 3. And I mentioned Kenny Golladay. That's your 1,000-yard receiver. That's really your number 1. But after that, you've got Marvin Jones. You've got Danny Amendola, some smaller guys. You brought in Geronimo Allison as potentially a possession receiver. But man, you get an explosive receiver like Donovan Peoples-Jones, take some of that pressure off of Kenny Golladay. I think you really have something. Then you have TJ Hawkinson at tight end. Man, I really like that fit. Moving on, Devin Duvernay going to the Browns. 5'11", 200 pounds, really stocky, powerful receiver. One of the guys that really racked up the receptions. Was among the nation's leaders in receptions. A guy who is strong after the catch, excellent route runner, 106 catches, 1,386 yards, 9 touchdowns, kind of quietly did that there at Texas. And people weren't talking about him. Everyone still wanted to talk about Colin Johnson. But it was Devin Duvernay who I think actually is going to be the better pro. And I look at Devin Duvernay, he knows how to get open. He can be that vertical threat. He can be a tough guy that goes over the middle. And his ability to do a little bit of everything. I like him with the Browns. Give Baker Mayfield another weapon there to go with OBJ and Jarvis Landry. A little bit more of a vertical threat than Landry is. And I think he takes some pressure off of those two guys, especially sending him up the seam. I really like that fit. And then at the end of round number 3, I got a big physical receiver for the Ravens. You take Marquise Brown in round number 1 in 2019. In 2020, you're going with Antonio Gandy Golden, AGG. And I love Antonio Gandy Golden. He's a big dude, very physical. 150 catches there for the Flames, at Liberty. In just 2 seasons, over 2,400 yards, 20 touchdowns. The catch radius is insane. Can get late separation. Not the fastest guy. He ran a 4.6 40, but he has really good length. 6'4", 223 pounds. A guy to really watch out for. Very comfortable, easy, effortless pass catcher. You saw that in the gauntlet there at the combine. Has a flair for the acrobatic, really, good body control along the sideline. Keep an eye on Antonio Gandy Golden. I think that'd be a nice fit there with the Ravens. Moving on to round 4, I think the Giants have a lot of receivers that really feel like the same guy, the same type of skill set. You've got Golden Tate, you've got Sterling Shepard on the roster, and then Darius Slayton, the guy that wants to get vertical. But what you're really and they brought in Corey Coleman as well. What you're lacking is one of the bigger receivers on the roster. And I think this might be a little bit higher than some people have him going, but I really like Isaiah Hodgins. He's 6'4", 200 pounds. 86 receptions, over 1,100 yards and 13 touchdowns this past season. Really a nice possession receiver, very sure-handed guy, huge catch radius, just doesn't drop the ball. 6'4", 210, ran a 4.61 40. That's really not what you're getting him for. He's a guy that's going to be that reliable big target, a weapon in the red zone, a guy that can catch the ball on the outside, not afraid to go over the middle. I like Isaiah Hodgins there. And then looking at Quintez Cephas going to the Chargers in round 4, 6'1", 202. Look, that 4.73, but can forget about that. He ran in the high 4.5s at his individual workout. And with Cephas, what you're getting, he always seemed to get vertical. He was winning at the line of scrimmage and was getting vertical, beating guys down the field. And that's really how he won there at Wisconsin. A lot of teams playing in the box as well. He was able to win off the line and get vertical and get behind guys. And I like his toughness, his physicality. He's going onto a team that really only has Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. Quintez Cephas would be a nice pickup for whoever's going to be playing quarterback. I think it's going to be Justin Herbert, but we'll have to see come draft day. After that, Lynn Bowden Jr., really kind of that dynamic receiver, played quarterback, was a running back, receiver, could be your Antoine Randall L guy, maybe a Tavon Austin, a guy that can do a little bit of everything. I'm looking at the Dallas Cowboys, and the Cowboys, I think they need another receiver. And what's going to be fun, this is a guy that's really kind of can play a multitude of positions. And, I think for these types of players, offensive coordinators can really get creative with them and run a lot of different plays. You've got Amari Cooper, you've got Michael Gallup, Cedric Wilson's coming on the roster, Devin Smith, kind of a vertical threat. But I think this just adds a different dynamic to that offense. And with Dak Prescott, with Ezekiel Elliott, I think it would really be interesting to have a guy like that on the roster. Moving on to Colin Johnson. Colin Johnson of Texas, mentioned him, big physical receiver. And if you look at the Buffalo Bills at some point, they're going to need to get another receiver, add weapons to the roster for Josh Allen. Absolutely. John Brown, vertical threat, little guy. You've got Stephon Diggs, who's going to be the playmaker there for them. Cole Beasley, really a nice slot receiver. But look, this team was desperate for wide receiver help. They brought Duke Williams back. A guy that hadn't been in the NFL the last couple of years. I think he was playing in the CFL. And, I like Colin Johnson here. Colin Johnson, again, big physical receiver, and really does a good job, contorting his body, making the difficult catch. Had a breakout year in 2018, 68 catches, 985 yards, 7 touchdowns. Only played in 7 games in 2019. Really struggled with some injuries. But I think he's a guy, he also has the frame that could potentially bulk up and be a tight end. I think copycat league, teams are going to be looking for a receiver that they can potentially mold into the next Darren Waller, 6'6", 222 pounds. And when you look at the Bills, they have Dawson Knox at tight end, Tyler Kroft, Lee Smith. They don't have, an explosive wideout at the tight end position other than Dawson Knox. So there's always that potential there with Colin Johnson. Moving on, Van Jefferson, a guy, if you haven't watched this guy run routes, it's beautiful to behold. This is a guy that'll beat you to the outside on one play with one release. The very next play, he'll beat you back to the inside, completely different footwork off the line, completely different release, and gets the receiver, the corners turned around, really gets them guessing. His father, Sean Jefferson, really a guy that is a savvy route runner, not the fastest guy in the world. We knew that. When you watched him there in Gainesville with the Florida Gators, wasn't going to be the most explosive receiver, but just one of the more reliable receivers. And I'm looking at the Saints. Michael Thomas, explosive receiver. We know that. Emmanuel Sanders brought in to kind of be that number 2 guy, a guy that can be versatile and explosive in the slot. And I think getting a receiver on the outside there, Van Jefferson could potentially be kind of like that Justin Jefferson type of guy in a Joe Brady type offense that they had there at LSU. I know Brady is with Carolina now, but work with me here. He was a guy that came from the New Orleans Saints. Drew Brees, get him a guy that can take some pressure off of Michael Thomas. They need to add some receivers there. They could very well end up taking a receiver earlier than the 4th round. But I really like Van Jefferson. I like the fit. KJ Hill going to Seattle. KJ Hill, another guy that ran a 4.6 40 at the combine, but a guy who was, another, I don't know what they do at Ohio State. The receivers just know how to run routes. He knows how to get open. Very smooth, very polished as a route runner. Not the most explosive guy, but he's not going to be asked to be the explosive wide out there in Seattle. You got Tyler Lockett, you've got DK Metcalf. This is a guy who's going to bring a completely different dimension to that receiving core. And look, this past season, just 11.2 yards per reception, and which was really consistent with his game, just 11.6 yards per reception in his career, but still, managed over 200 catches, over 2,300 yards and 20 touchdowns for the Buckeyes. So a model of consistency. And I think he fits very well with what Pete Carroll wants to do. Now, KJ Hill, I'm sorry, transitioning from one KJ to another, I got mixed up there. KJ Hamler, Penn State, redshirt sophomore, explosive, a guy that some people were talking about potentially in the 1st round at the beginning. But I was saying for a while, kind of pump the brakes with him because he has some trouble with drops. That's really the biggest concern that I have more than anything else with KJ Hamler. Yes, he's explosive. I think he struggles with contact. I think he struggles at the catch point. Go up with 2 hands. Don't go up with 1 hand. Go up with 2 hands, especially when you're going up in traffic. If you go up in traffic with 1 hand, what are you going to do? You're not going to be able to hold on to the football unless you've got stick them there to your gloves. And I'm looking at Jacksonville. They have Marquise Lee. Don't know how much longer he's going to be there in Jacksonville. You've got DJ Chark. You've got D.D. Westbrook. I think getting another speedster on the outside, a guy that you can put in the slot and be a dynamic receiver. If KJ Hamler can really work on his hands, I think he can be effective there for the Jaguars. Over 900 yards as a redshirt sophomore in 2019. a guy who can also be versatile in the return game. He's a smaller guy. He's just 5'9", and kind of a slight build as well, which kind of concerns me. I think that's why I've moved him down on my draft board. 5'9", 178, shorter arms. Really starts making you a little bit more nervous as you look at this. So that's why I think his draft stock is going to slide. But a guy who can be explosive, fourth round to the Jags makes sense for me. I think the Buccaneers sitting in the fourth round, they're going to be looking to protect Tom Brady and get some additional weapons. I think they find a running back in round 2 in J.K. Dobbins. They get a tackle, Tristan Wirfs, in round 1. They get Jonah Jackson in round 3. That's my guard that they can throw in there. And then I think they go with the wide receiver. And I'm looking in round 4, and I'm looking for a guy who's an ascending prospect, a guy that I think is going to come out of nowhere, much like Chris Godwin did coming out of Penn State. And he was around, a fourth rounder. I'm looking at John Hightower out of Boise State. Now check this out. Hear me out. 6'1", 189, ran a 4.43 40 at the combine, 38.5-inch vertical leap. So we know he's explosive. And this is a guy who, he had a big play potential there for the Broncos. Playing on that blue turf, Albertson Stadium, Boise, Idaho, 943 yards, 18.5 yards per reception, 8 touchdowns. Also a kick returner. Ended up returning one for a touchdown this past season. And he was the most reliable option there for Hank Bachmeier, Jalen Henderson, the quarterbacks there for Boise State. And a guy who I think can be another vertical threat. And I'm looking at Tom Brady, and you have Mike Evans, you have Chris Godwin. You need to get some other versatile weapons. And Tom Brady, what did he not really have? He didn't have the speedsters, the guys that are going to be able to stretch the field. And if Tom Brady's going to have a say in who he's going to bring in on the roster, he's going to want some speedsters, some guys that are going to be able to stretch the field. I'm looking at John Hightower. I think he's a guy who's just going to be continuing to be an ascending prospect. I like that pick. And then I'm looking at the Redskins sitting there towards the bottom of round number 4. And I think at some point they need to find another receiver. And I'm looking at Tyler Johnson out of Minnesota, a guy who I thought was one of the more dynamic receivers this past season, there for the Gophers. And I look at the receiving core. They have Terry McLaurin, Kelvin Harmon, Cody Latimer, Trey Quinn, the former Mr. Irrelevant. So there are a lot of different guys on this roster, really kind of a hodgepodge at the receiver position. And what I like about Tyler Johnson's game, I think he's a guy who he loves the slant. This is the guy that will win a slant every day of the week. He's more of a possession guy. I don't think he's the most explosive wideout, but look, model of consistency the last 2 years in his career with the Gophers, over 200 receptions, 3,300 yards, 33 touchdowns, back-to-back seasons with at least 12 receptions, 1,000-yard receiving seasons in each of the last 2 seasons as well. He did, I think, turn people off a little bit, not showing up to the Senior Bowl, and then also didn't work out at the combine. Really, kind of messed things up with COVID-19 because some of the workouts teams didn't really get to work you out at, like you want to see them in person. 6'1", 206. I think end of round 4 though. He could very well slide into round 5, but I think end of round 4 kind of makes some sense as well. So moving on to round number 5, and I'm looking at the Bengals. I think the Bengals need to get another wideout at some point. You're asking why. You've got A.J. Green. They brought him back, franchise tag, but remember, he was injured. John Brown can't stay healthy. And then you've got Tyler Boyd, who really needs some help. Auden Tate kind of filled in nicely. Alex Erickson's more of a possession guy. And I'm looking at James Prochet. This was a guy who all he does is win off the line. He reminds me a little bit of Cooper Kupp, not the most explosive receiver by any means. He showed up at the combine and didn't run. 5'11", 201. I don't think he was going to run the fastest 40 time, probably running in the 4.6 range, which is exactly what Cooper Kupp did. But when you watch Prochet, he wins off the line constantly. And look, this past season over, 111 receptions, 1,225 yards and 15 touchdowns, which equates to, in his 4-year career with the Mustangs, 301 receptions, just under 4,000 yards and 39 touchdowns. Now, there was just a 13.1 yard per reception. He's going to be the possession guy. you've got plenty of speedsters on the outside. He's a possession guy, a guy who knows how to get open, a guy who can create late separation, is just going to be a go-to target, a guy who has, incredible hands. You just put the ball anywhere around this guy. He may not be the tallest guy, but he'll go up and attack the football. He'll be able to lay out for the ball and just contort his body, the body control, the awareness, where he is out on the football field. He's another guy that I really like. And I think he ends up falling just because he could be that third round guy, but I think he falls a couple of rounds because of just how deep this wide receiving class is. Bryan Edwards out of South Carolina, a receiver that people just kind of forget about. He battled some injuries, and so he is a guy that I think slips on some people's radar, but he's a big physical wideout, a guy who, again, model of consistency, over 200 receptions, over 3,000 yards, and 22 touchdowns in his career with the Gamecocks, just 13 yards per reception in his career as well. So another guy who, he can get vertical when needed, but he's a guy who's going to attack the middle of the field, a possession guy, very much so. And, when you look at what he was able to do, if I can find it, at the combine, he didn't work out. So another guy that you wanted to see work out and he didn't, but 6'3", 212, decent arm length as well. But a guy who I think can be a possession wideout. And what I'm looking at is I'm looking at the Texans, and I think the Texans, they need to find a wide receiver. They ended up picking up Brandon Cooks, and they could very well end up taking a receiver much earlier. I had them taking Brandon Aiyuk, and that was before they brought in Brandon Cooks. They made that trade with the Rams. They gave up one of their 2 second-round picks. I think that allows them to focus on the defensive line. But that receiving core now: Brandon Cooks, Kenny Stills, Randall Cobb, Will Fuller, Kiki Kuti, a lot of smaller speedster type receivers. So I think a bigger receiver, a possession guy like Bryan Edwards would be a nice complementary receiver for that receiving core. Moving into round number 6, and these are some of the guys that you want to keep an eye out for. Courtney Davis out of Texas A&M, a guy that wasn't super productive. They had a lot of receivers there. They like to run the ball a little bit too, but Courtney Davis, look, 6'1", 201, ran a 4.5, 440, 35.5-inch vertical leap. He's going to be a guy that I think is going to offer some versatility there on the outside. Just played in 2 seasons for the Aggies, left after his junior year. He's a guy that could very well fall to round number 7, but a guy who I think has some versatility to him to where he can be an option in the 6th round. So I actually have Courtney Davis going off the board to the Dolphins. I think the Dolphins, looking for receivers, I think they may end up going receiver much sooner. But if they wait until round number 6, that could be a selection. I'm looking at Isaiah Coulter going to the Chargers in round 6, and I'm really excited about this. I think Coulter, the one FCS receiver that did not, that came out early, out of Rhode Island, and a guy, 72 receptions, over 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns there for the Rams. And what Coulter did at the combine, shows up 6'2", 198, ran a 4.4, 540, and a receiver who I think has some explosiveness to him. And I just look at that receiving core. I think he's a guy that can come in there and really be a weapon, one of those versatile weapons, has the length, can stretch defenses, not afraid to go over the middle, can make plays on the outside as well, outside the numbers. And I think if it's Justin Herbert or Jordan Love, Tua, whoever's going to be quarterback for the Chargers, I think he'll end up being one of those guys, he and Quintez Cephas, that are going to see a lot of passes thrown their way. I mentioned the Browns looking at a receiver in round 3. I think they look for another receiver in round 6. We talked about him in last podcast at the running back position, but Antonio Gibson, and really the thing that I really like about Gibson is, look, he's 6 foot, 228 pounds, very physical guy as a receiver, over 19 yards per reception, also 11.2 yards per carry on the ground, and 28 yards per kickoff return, took one back to the house. Very versatile weapon. He looks like a running back, runs the ball like a running back, but he's also a receiver. Worked out with the receivers in at the combine in Indy. Ran a 4.3940 though. So it's one of those guys, very explosive, smaller hands. 8 and 5/8 inches among the smaller hands in the group. So you worry about that a little bit at the wide receiver position, more so I think than the quarterbacks or anything else. When you've got a receiver that's going to be plucking the ball out of the air, you want to have a receiver with some of those bigger hands. But I don't think that really affected him there at Memphis. And I like him. He could very well come off the board sooner, but with the draft class that we have, I think he ends up falling a little bit. And the Browns picking him up, giving them another versatile weapon. I mentioned the Jags taking a receiver there in round number 4. I think they end up looking for another receiver in round 6. I'm looking at Benjamin Victor, or Ben Victor, as I believe he may be wanting to be called now. Another guy, possession receiver, good length there on the outside. Ran a 4.640, but he's 6'4", 198 pounds. Another really good, savvy route runner. Look, if you get a receiver out of Ohio State, chances are what you're getting is a guy who's not overly explosive, but a guy who knows how to get open. And Ben Victor, just 83 catches, over 1,300 yards, 16.1 yards per reception, 18 touchdowns. There were a lot of talented receivers there, so not enough passes to go around. So that's why you had just 83 receptions, but he was a very reliable target. And 6th round, I think, fits for him. Moving on to round 7, we'll go quickly with this. The Titans, I think they need another receiver. Kalijah Lipscomb is a guy that I really like. A guy for a while was leading the SEC in receptions in 2018, 2019. You really can't fault him. Don't look at the stats. That's not going to be everything that's going to be telling you about Lipscomb. I think he's a guy who can be a nice possession receiver there. 6 foot 207, ran a 4.5740 at the combine. I think going to the Titans, being that complimentary receiver makes a lot of sense. The Ravens, I think they go back to the well. They need to find some more receivers, receiving targets there for Lamar Jackson. I'm looking at Aaron Parker. He's Isaiah Coulter's receiving buddy there at Rhode Island. He was the big stat guy, 81 catches, over 1,200 yards, 9 touchdowns in 2019 as a senior, over 3,400 yards and 30 touchdowns in his career, 216 receptions. He's the bigger, more physical guy in that group. I think he does fall a little bit because they have a lot of those same guys. Ran that 4.5740 at the combine. But I think round number 7, Ravens need to get some additional weapons. I think that'd be a nice pick. Mentioned the Dolphins needing to add multiple wide receivers. How about you get one of the guys who ran one of the fastest times at the combine, Quez Watkins. Quez Watkins, ran a blistering 4.3540, 6 foot 185. And look, at Southern Miss, he came out a year early and kind of knew that was going to happen after 64 catches, over 1,100 yards, 6 touchdowns, but the 18.4 yards per reception. You knew just how dynamic this guy was on the outside. And I think with the Dolphins, at some point the Dolphins need to find a dynamic receiver. I think they have all these holes, and the receiver position, to me, I didn't think they needed to necessarily go high in the draft because you have Devontae Parker, you have Preston Williams, Allen Hurns coming off of the injury. Albert Wilson was a nice complimentary piece. Do you necessarily need to go receiver? Maybe you go a little bit early. Maybe you go in the 3rd round, 4th round. But I don't know that the Dolphins need to reach for a wide receiver. I actually really like these 2 receivers for them, Watkins and Davis. KJ Osborne going to the Patriots. That just feels like a nice fit. This was a grad transfer out of Buffalo, moved to the Hurricanes, and look, this was a passing attack that was really downright abysmal. He had over 800 yards receiving, 7 touchdowns, really built up nice rapport with Tyree Jackson. In Miami, the production dropped off just 10, under 11 yards per reception, had 547 yards receiving, just 5 touchdowns. He's a guy, he actually ran a much faster 40 time at the combine. I was not expecting him to run a 4.48, 5'11", 203. I think he's one of those receivers, nice possession receiver. Actually has a little bit more speed there. Going to the Patriots in round 7 makes a lot of sense. Juwan Jennings, a big physical guy. I have him going to the Vikings. Look, Vikings could use another big physical receiver. And we talked about that previously. And Juwan Jennings is a guy who's just going to run people over. There's a good chance. I look at Courtney Davis. Maybe I have him coming off the board a little too soon. Maybe Juwan Jennings is the guy that ends up going to the Dolphins, although I think the Dolphins have a lot of those bigger physical guys, especially with Preston Williams on the roster. But look, Juwan Jennings, 59 catches, still went over 900 yards, 8 touchdowns in his senior season. If he stays healthy, he had played in just one game in 2017, going down to the season-ending injury. But big physical dude. Look, I have him penciled in round number 7, and I look at some of these other receivers. Maybe he can. His ceiling's really in the 4th to 5th round range. So I kind of regret putting him all the way down in round number 7 because he is a big physical wideout. So we'll see. We'll see what ends up happening with my final mock draft. But I think he's somebody who could be a steal on day 3. And then Lawrence Cager to the Giants. I mentioned that they need to get those big, long receivers. Giants, this would be the Mr. Irrelevant pick. And Cager, he was with Miami, and he moved to Georgia as a grad transfer for his final year. And with Cager, when you look at his numbers, his stats, not overly impressive, so you can't really look at that. 78 catches, over 1,100 yards, 14 touchdowns, but the length. He's pretty sudden for a guy his size, in and out of his breaks. I think he could be a possession receiver, a guy that has absolute, awesome length, over 33-inch arms, 6'5", 220 pounds, bigger physical guy. I think he and Hodgins, similar receivers, and that's kind of what the Giants like to do. They have a lot of similar receivers with the speed. I think they get 2 bigger wideouts. I think that really rounds out their receiving core a little bit. So that's going to be the wide receiver position. I think, some other guys, some other names to be on the lookout for. I really like Omar Bayless, out of Arkansas State, put up huge numbers for them, ran a 4.62 40 at the combine. Really kind of, might turn you off a little bit with that. But I thought that he was the guy who showed that he can get open. Chris Fink, out of Notre Dame, 5'9", 186, 40-inch vertical leap, just running a 4.57 40. Look, Hunter Renfrow, he could be this year's Hunter Renfrow, and Chris Fink could end up being a 5th-round pick. So keep an eye out for him. Let's see, Tristan Jackson out of Syracuse. He came out a year early, 6'1", 197 pounds, went over 1,000 yards this past season for the Orangemen. He's a guy to keep an eye out for. Juwan Johnson out of Oregon. Very inconsistent hands, but he's 6'4", 230 pounds, a guy who could potentially develop into a tight end. Let's see, as we go through, Joe Reed is kind of an intriguing prospect, 6 foot, 224 pounds, big physical wideout, but ran a 4.47, 38-inch vertical leap. He's one of those guys that's kind of a tweener. What do you really do with him? But I like his ability to make some plays there for the Cavaliers. He's another guy to keep an eye out for. Kendrick Rogers, kind of this, he's the mystery guy there for Texas A&M. 6'4", 208, ran a 4.5 140. Wasn't all that productive. That was a concern that I had. I think Darrell Stewart out of Michigan State will get a look as well. 6 foot, 212 pounds. A guy who is their number 1 receiver. Can be a dynamic option. As well. Jeff Thomas out of Miami, 5'9", 170, ran a 4.45 40, a guy that, you can play in the slot and a guy who's going to get vertical a little bit. He's also a guy that I think would get a look. So those are the receivers to be on the lookout for as priority free agents, which then takes us to the tight end position. And I look at where we're at. We're a little bit pressed for time, but the tight end position in this year's draft, the talent level really isn't there at the tight end position, at least at the top of the draft. And if you look at these last 5 drafts prior, 2015, no tight ends taken in round number 1, still had 19 tight ends taken. There were 14 taken in the last 3 rounds of that draft. I mean, that's really incredible how back heavy that draft. That was the year that Max Williams went number 2 or in the 2nd round. And then, some other guys, Jesse James went in the 5th round. James O'Shaughnessy still playing with the Jags. He went off in the 5th round as well. Really kind of a weird draft that year. Not really a whole lot of guys that are coming out that are going to be the explosive pass catchers. 2016, it dropped to 11 tight ends. I think that was really, you didn't have another dynamic tight end option there. Hunter Henry went in the 2nd round there to the Chargers. After that, you had Austin Hooper, Nick Vannett, Tyler Higbee. So you had a little bit of depth there at the top, but there really wasn't any depth to that draft class. 2017, 14 tight ends taken, 3 in round number 1. OJ Howard, Evan Engram, David Njoku, all playmakers. You had Gerald Everett come off in round number 2. He's done a little bit there with the Rams, emerging prospect. Jonnu Smith, really taking over for Delaney Walker. He came off the board in round number 3. And that was the draft that we had Mr. George Kittle go number 146 overall in the 5th round. Who's going to be the next George Kittle? That's really what the teams are looking for. Maybe not necessarily a guy that was used in the passing game, but a tremendous athlete. That's really what George Kittle was. 2018, 15 tight ends taken. You had 5 go off the board in round 4. I think that was what was interesting. Only 1 tight end taken in round number 1. That was Hayden Hurst. This was the draft that you also had Mike Gesicki, Dallas Goedert, and Mark Andrews come off the board after him. A lot of people think that Hunter Hurst is really going to be that dynamic receiver that Austin Hooper was in Atlanta. He's got Matt Ryan throwing him the football, so it is going to be interesting there. Will Dissly showed off a little bit of athleticism there for Seattle. He was taken in round number 4. And then if you look at 2019, 16 tight ends taken. You had 8 come off the board in the first 2 days of the draft. Obviously, the 2 Iowa Hawkeyes taken in round number 1, Hawkinson, TJ Hawkinson going to the Lions at number 8, Noah Fant, number 20 overall to the Broncos. After that, Irv Smith Jr. getting some time there in Minnesota. And then some guys that, Dawson Knox, mentioned him going off the board to Buffalo at number 96 overall. Drew Sample, Josh Oliver, Jace Sternberger, Kahale Warring, guys that have yet to really showcase what they can do at this point. But look, like Drew Sample, Cincinnati, Tyler Eifert's no longer there. He's going to need to step up. Josh Oliver in Jacksonville, they need help at the tight end position. With Jimmy Graham, and Green Bay, he's gone. I think Green Bay needs to get a little bit more out of Jay Sternberger. I think Green Bay is going to end up looking for a tight end in round number 2. You got Mercedes Lewis sitting there. You need some help at that tight end position. Foster Moreau, I thought, was a nice surprise for Oakland. A guy who surprising athleticism, better than expected hands. There for the Raiders as well. So there's a guy in this year's draft who kind of reminds me as the next Foster Moreau, and that's Dalton Keene. We'll be talking about him here in just a minute. So when I look at the 2020 draft, I don't have a tight end that's worthy of a first round pick. I only have 1 going in round number 2. I've got 3 that come off the board in round 3. Really, the depth of this draft is going to be on day 3. I have 2 coming off the board in round 4, 6 in round 6, and 2 in round 7. So kind of back heavy with this draft. And when I take a look at the draft, I look at Cole Kmet. I think he's the most complete tight end. I think he's the most NFL ready tight end. Is he the guy with the highest ceiling? I don't think so. But what you do have with Kmet is a guy who, look, he ran a 4.66 40 at the combine, I believe, which was faster than I thought he was going to run. I'm sorry, he actually ran a 4.7 40. 6'6", 262 pounds, still showed off a 37-inch vertical leap. Tremendous athlete. I thought that he's a guy that, really good inline blocker. I'm looking at Green Bay. I think they need that tight end. Whoever the top tight end, I think Green Bay is going to be the one to jump up and snatch him. 43 receptions, 515 yards, and 6 touchdowns. I think what Green Bay wants to find is a complete tight end, and I think that's what Cole Kmet can bring. But hot on his heels is going to be Bryson Hopkins out of Purdue. I have him going to the Bengals in round 3. He could very well be the number 1 tight end off the board and could end up going to Green Bay. Let's just put that out there now. I think he's a little, he's also physical, ran a 4.66 40 at the combine, 6'4", 245 pounds. A guy who is a weapon up the seam. I think he's a better athlete. They may have similar speed vertically, but I think in terms of being able to sink their hips and get in and out of breaks, I like Bryson Hopkins there. Look, 830 yards reception, yards receiving in 2019, and had 17.1 yards per reception in 2018. So he's a guy that shows that he can be a volume catcher when needed, can also be a guy that can be versatile and be a weapon down the middle of the field. I really like Bryson Hopkins. Look, Tyler Eifert is gone in Cincinnati, so I think that makes a lot of sense. And then the Saints. The Saints have, they have Jared Cook. They don't have anybody really behind him. Josh Hill really hasn't been able to step up. Here's my favorite tight end in this draft. He's a John Mackey Award winner, went over 1,000 yards with Lane Kiffin at Florida Atlantic. It's Harrison Bryant. And the thing that I really like about Harrison Bryant is I think he's a really good route runner. He's 6'5", 243, 4'7", 340, not the most explosive guy, but what I really like about him is his ability to get open and pick up yards after the catch in bunches. I think he's a long strider, and that's really what I really enjoy watching him play. A guy that's going to attack the football in the air. He's a guy to me can be that dynamic receiving option there for New Orleans. After Harrison Bryant, I think the next guy that you really have to look at and target after that is going to be Adam Troutman. Now, the thing that I really like about Adam Troutman is, this is a guy who's just a versatile, dynamic weapon, for Dayton. And I use dynamic a lot. But, with Troutman, what's so impressive is, 70 catches, 916 yards, 14 touchdowns, 31 touchdowns in his career, a guy that just dominated at that FCS level for the Dayton Flyers, and a guy who I think can be an inline blocker a little bit as well. 6'5", 255, ran a 4.8 40, looked to be really straining with a lot of the workouts, but I thought what was really impressive was the 6'7", 8 3-cone drill. So this is a guy that can really sink his hips, get in and out of his cuts, and that's really how he wins, is with a lot of his breaks. And I like him going to the Patriots. I think he's the guy that the Patriots are going to target. And look, Albert Owe-Bunam with Missouri ran that 4.49 40. We knew he was going to run fast. That's one of the things that you really knew about Owe-Bunam. I don't think anyone knew that he was going to run that fast. I think Owe-Bunam could end up moving into the round 2 discussion and could very well end up going to the Saints. I mentioned that Harrison Bryant, but when you run a 4.49, teams take notice. And this is a guy, he struggled to stay healthy at Mizzou. When he was healthy, he was a favorite option of Drew Lock. As a freshman, 11 touchdowns, had 98 catches in his career, over 1,100 yards, 23 touchdowns, but only played in 9 games in each of his 3 seasons with the Tigers. And that's going to be the biggest concern. And that's why his draft stock may fall. And that's why we're talking about him potentially in round number 4. Thaddeus Moss, have him going to the Cardinals in round 4, 6'2", 250 pounds, had the fracture in his foot. Wasn't able to compete at the combine, but a nice receiving option. 6'2", 250, looks kind of a buffed up wide receiver. Showed excellent body control with his hands. Can be a weapon down the field. A guy that's going to attack the middle of the field as well. I don't think that he's necessarily the best blocking option, if you will. So if you're looking for a blocking tight end, I don't think Thaddeus Moss is going to be that guy. I don't know that he's necessarily as explosive as some of the other tight ends in this draft class. I think round 4, round 5 is about the right fit for him. Hunter Bryant, I have him going to the Jaguars in round 4. And look, Hunter Bryant, he reminded me a lot of Evan Engram with the way that he played on the outside. Big, he looked like a bigger physical wide receiver and really presented a lot of mismatches against safeties, because he would split out wide and then he would line up in the slot, be an inline tight end, really a versatile option there at Washington. And he was really productive as well. 52 catches, over 800 yards, just 3 touchdowns though. But a guy who, 16.4 yards per reception in his career. I think he can be a guy for Jacksonville. They need to get another tight end, a pass catcher there. Really don't have that option on the roster. You've got other guys that can be those blockers. You've got James O'Shaughnessy, as I mentioned earlier. Tyler Eifert did show up on the roster, but he can't stay healthy. If he can stay healthy, then I think, Hunter Bryant still becomes another weapon there for Gardner Minshew. You do have Josh Oliver, but I think getting a guy like Hunter Bryant on that roster just gives them another weapon in that passing attack. Devin Asiasi, I'm looking at him in round number 6, going to the Washington Redskins. What I like about Asiasi is his ability to stretch the defense up the seam. 6'3", 257, faster than I thought, ran a 4.7 340. Not the most explosive guy, and that's what I think is a bit of a cause for concern. Not the most explosive guy, but a guy who can be a dynamic blocker. I think that's one of the things that you saw there at UCLA, blocking for Joshua Kelly. But really all of his production in 2019 was a transfer from Michigan. But first full season there with the Bruins, cut short due to injury, but in 2019, 44 catches, 641 yards, 4 touchdowns. A guy that, again, can get down the field, down the middle of the field, up the seam. I think putting him in Washington with the Redskins, I think makes some sense. Washington in need of a tight end. Jeremy Sprinkle, Richard Rodgers, Logan Thomas on the roster. Vernon Davis no longer there. So I think that makes some sense. Moving on from that, Cheyenne O'Grady. The Dolphins, they have Mike Gesicki. I think they need another tight end option. And the thing with Cheyenne O'Grady, CJ O'Grady, he was also went by for a time there with Arkansas. 6'4", 243, only ran a 4.8 40. Had some issues off the field with Arkansas. Ultimately left the program. But when he was there on the roster, he was a guy that, again, could break some tackles, can get vertical up the seam. 87 catches in his career, really over 3 seasons, 967 yards, 12 touchdowns. And look, he only played in 8 games in 2018, slowed due to injury. And then in 2019, only played in 7 games before leaving the team. He's one guy that I think is kind of the question mark, is that mystery. Is he going to go higher than expected? Teams have to do their interviews, do their homework with him. He's also a guy that could potentially fall out of the draft, not even get selected at all. So that's going to be an interesting pick there. Josiah DeGuara, I think, is a guy for Cincinnati. The Bearcats kind of did a little bit of everything. Could be that H-back and could also be the tight end and inline blocker. One of the more powerful tight ends in this year's draft class. And I think the New York Jets need to get a tight end. You get guys out of Cincinnati. You get guys like Travis Kelce. He's 6'2", 242, ran a 4.7, 240, 25 reps at 225 in the bench press. He's one of those guys I look at the tight end position that could potentially be another George Kittle type. He's not going to be as fast as George Kittle, who ran in the 4.5s. But I think he can be one of those weapons. And when you're talking about the Jets and you're talking about Sam Darnold, you need to get guys that can be a reliable option in the passing game. They have Ryan Griffin. They have Christopher Herndon on the roster. They need to get another pass catching tight end. Don't be surprised if Albert Owe-Bunum ends up going to the Jets much earlier in the draft, by the way. I think if you get him with some speed and then potentially get either CeeDee Lamb or Henry Ruggs III, you really have helped Sam Darnold out. So the more I sit here and look at it, I still think DeGuara would be a nice pickup here. They already have Trevin Wesco as the fullback. I think, Jets may or may not be the option. But I think DeGuara is a guy that's going to come off the board in round 6. Jared Pinkney, look, everyone was talking about him as the number 1 tight end in this year's draft class. I have him falling all the way to round 6. I think the Colts will do their homework with him, see if everything checks out. Look, over 114 receptions in his career, over 1,500 yards, 14 touchdowns, had 50 catches for over 700 yards and 7 touchdowns as a junior. And Vandy's offense really sputtered and really slowed in 2019, played in only 8 games. And look, he only played in an entire season just once, and that was as a junior. So there are some concerns there. Ran a really abysmal time at the combine, ran a 4.96 40, but I think he's one of the more complete tight ends in this year's draft class. 6'4", 257, and I think Chris Ballard will do his homework, and if everything checks out off the field with him, then I think he could potentially be a steal there at the end of their draft. Dalton Keene, Virginia Tech, going to the 49ers in round 6. I look at him as being another potential Foster Moreau. That was the guy that I was talking about. And I thought, better than expected athleticism watching him at the combine. Again, 6'4", 253, 4.7, 140. I've always seen him as a blocker. Ran a 7.07 3-cone drill. I think that was second fastest only to Adam Troutman. And a guy showed off some pretty good hands, really comfortable catching the football there for at the combine. Didn't really wasn't asked to do that a whole lot there for the Hokies. He's one of those intriguing prospects, a guy that's going to be a day 3 pick. Just caught 59 passes, just 748 yards and 8 touchdowns in his career. Never went over 28 catches or 340 yards. But a guy who I think could be that number 2, number 3 tight end. And when you look at the 49ers, they have They have George Kittle, but behind him, Ross Dwelly. You need to have another guy that can be that versatile option. And I think Dalton Keene can end up filling that role and be a nice complement there for George Kittle at tight end. Colby Parkinson going to the Cowboys. I've mentioned a bunch of other tight ends. I'm kind of surprised myself that I have Colby Parkinson going here, but it's more so because of the team. I think he's ultimately going to end up in Dallas. Dallas desperately in need of a tight end. They could potentially be on the market for Albert Owe-Bunam earlier in the draft, but if they wait until round 6, Colby Parkinson, I think they trade up if they're going to go after him. Ran a 4.77 40 at the combine, but 6'7", 252 pounds. Really a weapon up the seam because he's able to use that height to his advantage. A red zone nightmare. Teams just do not want to see him going there, the ball going his way. I mean, because he is so big, just boxing guys out, really look like a basketball player and a man among boys. 48 catches, over 500 yards, just 1 touchdown in 2019, had 7 though in 2018. And when you think of Stanford, tight ends, you think of Zach Ertz, and you think of Austin Hooper, and there's Levine Toilolo that's out there as well. There are a lot of tight ends to come out of Stanford. Colby Parkinson is going to be next in line. I think he's going to be a better prospect than Dalton Schultz, who's already on the Cowboys roster. And that length, I think, is really going to be intriguing for Jerry Jones and company. Rounding out the tight end spot, you've got Charlie Taumapeu going to the Chargers in round 7. Reason why I like this, they lost Derek Watt, the fullback. They have Virgil Green there as number 2 tight end right now. After Hunter Henry, who was, they used the franchise tag on him. But what I like about Charlie Taumapeu, look, he's 6'2", 240 pounds, a guy who can fill that H-back, fullback role, can also be the tight end, 6'2", 240 pounds, 4.75 40, 36 and a half inch vertical leap, ran a 7 flat 3 cone drill. So another guy that, it shows that he can sink his hips, can get in and out of his breaks. It was a nice receiving option there at Portland State. In his career, went over 100 catches, 117 receptions, over 1,800 yards receiving, and 11 touchdowns. 3 straight seasons with at least 450 yards receiving. Really his breakout year was as a sophomore in 2017, 45 catches, 673 yards, and 3 touchdowns. As a junior, 20.7 yards per reception as well. So a dynamic pass catcher and a guy that I think, like I said, can fill a variety of roles. That's really what Derek Watt was able to do for them. And I think that'd be a nice pick for the Chargers in round 7. And then the Falcons need to have another tight end. They did bring in Hunter Hurst to man one of the tight end spots, especially now that you have Austin Hooper playing in Cleveland. So you had to make that trade. You bring in Hayden Hurst. After that, Kari Lee, Jaden Graham, Carson Meyer on the roster. I think you have to find a tight end. They may go tight end earlier in this draft. I mean, it's entirely possible, but if they don't, I'm looking at Steven Sullivan. I think this is a guy that's going to be a 7th round pick and be one of those sleepers, a guy that could be a dynamic pass catcher. He's 6'5", 248, ran a 4.66 40, 35 and 3/8 inch arms. I mean, just huge wingspan for this kid. And 36 and a half inch vertical leap. A guy who's going to be more of a vertical threat. I don't anticipate him being the quicker than fast category. I think a guy that struggles to really sink his hips to get low and played in just in his 3 seasons, played in just 24 games. But a guy who has some intriguing upside, intriguing athleticism. He could be a 7th round pick, could be one of those priority free agents that come off the board as well. So he's going to be one of those guys that's going to be on the bubble as a draftable prospect. Other guys to keep an eye out for, Jacob Breland there at Oregon. He showed that he could be an explosive option. Really, the biggest question is going to be the medicals. We don't really know there, but off to a great start in 2019. Through 6 games, 26 catches, over 400 yards, and 6 touchdowns. I think if the medicals check out for him, he's going to get himself drafted. Sean McCown out of Michigan, 6'5", 242 pounds. As I started talking and started looking at some of these tight ends that I have being drafted, the thing that I like about Sean McCown is his versatility, his blocking ability. Look, Richard Rodgers got himself drafted much earlier because he was able to block. And I look at Sean McCown, I think that's where he's going to end up falling, probably in the 5th or 6th round range. If I were to redo my draft and look, I have another week. So let me work on day 3, and you'll probably see some tight ends shuffled around here a little bit. Mitchell Wilcox ran that 4.88 40, really looked shaky catching the football. The South Florida tight end, 6'3", 247, undersized as it is. And, I thought that he's really going to have to work hard to convince teams to take him. Look, 100 receptions in his career, over 1,300 yards for the Bulls there at USF. But I don't know if he's going to be that option. I like Charlie Werner there at Georgia. Underrated athleticism, 6'5", 244 pounds, ran a 4.78 40, 34.5-inch vertical leap. He could potentially be another Foster Moreau type player. And then Dominic Wood-Anderson, 6'4", 261, not a speedster by any means, and a guy who I think is probably going to be a blocker, could potentially come off the board in that 6th to 7th round range because of his blocking ability. And some of the pass catchers that I named off could potentially fall out of the draft and be those priority free agents because, look, teams still have to run the football. They still need to protect their quarterbacks as well. So some of these blocking tight ends that I mentioned that I don't have coming off the board, I think they end up getting drafted when it's all said and done. I think you're still talking about 14 to 15 tight ends ultimately drafted. And you're going to have a couple of guys that'll get signed as priority free agents that could end up making the roster when it's all said and done. So we made it through all of our receivers and all of our tight ends. And that's 35 receivers taken. Plus, we talked about some other guys that are going to be those priority free agents, along with another 14 tight ends, plus, again, about 4 or 5 tight ends that could be those priority free agents as well. So we covered a lot of ground in just a short period of time. Hopefully that helps you get ready for the draft, get ready, some of the names to really think of when you're talking about the receiver and tight end position. I think there is some star power at the receiver position. A lot of receivers that I'm expecting to have breakout seasons as rookies. And I'm looking at, day 2, there are a lot of day 2 picks. Who's going to be this year's, Devontae Adams, or this year's Michael Thomas, Tyler Boyd, Juju Smith-Schuster. You're looking at some of these receivers, Michael Pittman Jr., kind of borderline, first, second round range, in my opinion. You got Jalen Reagor with his speed, Brandon Aiyuk, kind of a do-everything guy, Laviska Shenault if he can stay healthy, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Devin Duvernay, and that's, just sitting there at day 2, with CeeDee Lamb and Henry Ruggs and Jerry Jeudy, Justin Jefferson, T. Higgins, Denzel Mims, a lot of big names at the top of this draft. Inevitably there's going to be somebody in day 3. Who's it going to be? Who's going to be that guy? I mean, that's really what I want to know. Is it going to be Van Jefferson? Is it going to be John Hightower with his explosiveness? Can we see James Prochet really break out as a possession receiver? Isaiah Coulter, is he going to be that FCS receiver that really breaks out? Or is it going to be Aaron Parker, the more physical wide out there? It's really going to be a lot of fun. Juwan Jennings, I have him in the 7th round. Really can't believe I did that. I think he may end up coming off the board much sooner, possibly in round number 5. A lot of different questions there. Who's going to be that guy? And then the tight end position, Adam Troutman, a name that keeps coming up. He could potentially be that tight end who ultimately ends up taking everyone by storm. Look, Albert Owe-Bunam, if he can stay healthy, that dude's a speedster and a guy that could be an elite weapon. Cole Kmet, Bryson Hopkins, the more complete tight ends in this draft class. Harrison Bryant, I think pass catcher extraordinaire. Thaddeus Moss, Hunter Bryant, the undersized tight ends who could be pass catchers. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting at the skill positions. And, that's really, we've taken care of the skill positions. So the next podcast, we're going to look at the tackles, the guards, and the centers. So everybody there up front on the offensive line, I think Jedrick Wills, Mekhi Becton, Tristan Wirfs, Andrew Thomas, your top 4 offensive tackles. And then there's really a drop off after that. You've got Josh Jones, Austin Jackson, Isaiah Wilson, Ezra Cleveland coming off the board after that. The guards, big physical dudes like Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis, and Netane Muti and John Simpson. You've got the technicians like Jonah Jackson and Shane Lemieux, Ben Bredesen, Calvin Throckmorton, nasty guys like Logan Stenberg and Kevin Dotson, and movers and shakers like Solomon Kinley. And then at the center position, I think, Cesar Ruiz, versatile guy, the only interior lineman that I think has a first round grade. But you've got, Lloyd Cushenberry, Matt Hennessy, an excellent pass blocker. Tyler Biadasz coming from Wisconsin, as a Wisconsin offensive lineman, he's going to be well coached. Nick Harris is one of those guys who I think can play guard and center as well. And then Danny Pinter, a kid out of Ball State, a guy who can play all three positions there. I'm sorry, all five positions, I really should say. He can play tackle, he can play guard, he can play center, probably on either side. Probably going to play on the interior of the line, can play tackle in a pinch. But that versatility, it's like Graham Glasgow. You look at what he's able to do with the Lions at guard, talked about, or at center, I should say, and then potentially being moved to guard there with the Broncos. So I think there's a lot to talk about, a lot of nice players who are going to be the sleepers that could potentially fall into the round 3, round 4, round 5 range that teams can really jump on. We've got a lot to talk about, and with the draft being, just next week, we've got very little time to get through it all. So we're gonna fire these next few podcasts fast and furious. We'll take care of all the defense, D-line, linebackers, and defensive backs, and then we'll end things out with my final first round mock draft. Give you a little bit of sneak peek on day 2 and a little bit on day 3 as well to round things out. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get everything wrapped up. We'll move on into the weekend. And I hope everybody is staying safe, social distancing and such. For ReadyForTheDraft.com, this has been the Ready for the Draft podcast. I've been your host, Gregg Schutze. Take care, everyone, and I am out of here.